Okay, so I think we might be tag teaming tonight. I think Dan may be talking to you as well.
Well, then Dan needs to find himself a microphone.
Well, he will when we get to that point.
Okay.
But what I'm doing here is just trying to provide you with a big picture overview of TIF generally for those that may not know that much about it, and then dive into the 2022 activity in our 3 TIF districts and some projections for the future for those TIF districts. And then Mr. Driesens, I think, will be talking about a potential TIF 9, a new TIF. So TIF 101, and I got to do 2 buttons here at the same time. That might be a bit challenging for me. Okay. So starting with an overview. So tax increment financing was first enacted in the state of Wisconsin in 1976. And since then, Wisconsin has been a national leader in using TIF to attract investments and jobs into the state. At this point, 70% or more of Wisconsin cities and villages are using TIF. And on average, amongst all of those TIF districts, for every $1 of investment within a Wisconsin TIF district, $4.66 of additional tax base is created by the TIF district. So that's why people are using TIF. So just to go over some TIF basics, you know that there's a lot of acronyms that are bandied around, and TIF and TID are used somewhat interchangeably, but I thought you might be interested to know what the difference actually is. So the TIF is tax increment financing, which is the actual tool, and then TID is the tax increment district, which is the boundary within where the tool is being used. So essentially, TIF allows municipalities to capture incremental property tax revenue from growth in a defined area to benefit that area. So we're going to come back to the growth concept in the next couple of slides. But essentially, it's all about growth in the TIF. There's a 12% rule that applies to every municipality, which relates to the value of the allowed value of TIF districts. So a new TIF, when it's being created, and the old TIFs, if they exist, together cannot exceed 12% of the municipality's equalized value. So you may hear about the 12% rule, and that's what it is. And then also, I wanted just to touch on the fact that since 1976, there have been many, many changes to TIF law made by the legislature, including last week, which was referenced earlier tonight. And that adds a ton of complexity to creating and maintaining TIF districts and understanding all of those rules. And we do engage some outside resources to help us with that. But I'm not going to get into all of those rules tonight because we would be here forever. So there's various types of TIF or TID districts. Industrial, oh, thank you. Industrial, mixed use, blight, rehabilitation conservation districts, and environmental remediation districts. And
just a minute, when you say mixed use, what do you mean?
So mixed use allows for a combination of industrial, commercial, and housing or residential in the district. TIF districts are limited in life, but can be extended under certain circumstances. The limit is important because the idea is, as we mentioned before, at the end of the TID's life, it will create tax base that will be added to the city's tax base. So there's a limit of 20 years for mixed use and industrial TIDs, and 27 years for blighted and rehabilitation conservation TIDs. TIDs also have to close if all of the project costs have been met. And there is a period of time that's less than the total life that you can spend money in that TID, project cost end date. And so that is generally 5 to 7 years shorter than the actual life of the TID. Okay, so some pros and cons about TIDs, and these are just a few. There's probably many more that we could think of. But essentially, TID provides the city with a tool to attract development that otherwise would not occur. And that is part of the creation of a TID. The concept is the but-for rule. But for the TID, this development would not occur. So the idea is we are not just creating a TID around a development that was going to happen anyway, is already underway, but rather we're creating a TID to attract development, because if we did not have the TIF tools, we would not be able to get that development to come to the city. Another pro of TIF districts is that developers can be reimbursed for project costs from funds that otherwise would not exist. So this is in tandem with the but-for rule. So we're using the revenue streams from the taxes generated in the TIF to reimburse developers and to provide other ways to incentivize developers to build in the district. So those are the pros. Cons, the biggest con is that the city, and not the other taxing jurisdiction, is on the hook to cover TID costs if sufficient increment is not generated during the life of the TIF to cover all of the TIF costs. And that's a big hook. And it's something that we have to very seriously consider when we are working on developer agreements, when we're looking at our TIDs. And so bad developer agreements can overly burden the TID and can certainly therefore burden the city if they result in the TIF closing with a deficit fund balance or not covering all of its costs. Okay. So how does the TIF work? When the TID is created, parcels are identified which will be included in the TID. At the creation point, the value of these parcels is excluded from the TID's base value.
I believe that's fireworks.
That'd be fireworks, most likely.
Like right outside our window, but it's okay.
It could be worse.
4th of July in a few days.
Is it 4th of July already?
It'll be going soon.
Well, soon, it's the 4th of July.
It'll go on for the next 2 weeks anyway.
I thought they were celebrating my presentation because it was so good.
Should timed it out right to be the end.
Yeah.
So as I was saying, at the creation of the TID, the value of the parcels is excluded from the TID. So in other words, the value of those parcels at point of creation stays within the city's tax base. It does not become a part of the TID. But the taxes on that base value continue to the taxing jurisdictions as before. So if you have a $100,000 property that's already existing and it's a parcel that becomes part of a TIF, the taxes on that $100,000 parcel continue to go to those taxing jurisdictions, the city, the county, the school district, and the tech college. It's only the new growth or value in the TID that creates the increment for the TIF district itself. So looking at the next slide, you can see here, so what I've tried to capture here in this picture is if the TID was empty, let's say, when it started, maybe it's an empty field, then that would be your base value. And that would remain with the taxes generated on that base value going to the taxing jurisdictions. But if somebody constructed a new facility, a hotel or a factory or something, the new value generated by that new construction would, those taxes on that new value would be collected by the TID and do not go to the taxing jurisdictions. Now, in my picture, if you imagine that all of this in the picture was already created before the TID was created, then all of the value of those taxes would still go to the jurisdiction, and just new buildings that were going up would be the ones that would generate taxes that would be kept by the TID. And also, it's important to note that it's not just new construction. It can also just be value increases on existing property. So the base value is fixed. And then if that $100,000 property increases in value, let's say it goes up to $140,000, that $40,000 will generate taxes for the TID not for the taxing jurisdictions. So their taxes, including the cities, stays at the based on the value at time of TIC creation. So you might ask, well, why? Why would the city, because the city is included in this equation, why would the city give up taxes, and why would the other jurisdictions give up taxes that would be generated by the new development? And the simple answer is because the concept is that without the TID, the tax revenue wouldn't be generated. So they're actually not giving up anything. So I'll say that again.
That's the but for.
Pardon?
That's the but
That's
for.
the but for. So the concept is that if the TID was not created, there would not be the funding to provide the incentives, which would mean the developers would not come, which would mean there would be no new value. And so no taxes were being kept from the jurisdictions. And the city is a part of that. So the city also considers that because the city's giving up, quote unquote, future taxes, but it's actually not because those taxes would not be generated. The future tax revenue that's coming into the TID based on new construction and growth in the value of existing construction, that future tax revenue is used to offer the incentives to developers to hopefully bring their development to Platteville. So a couple of FAQs. I mean, you could come up with, probably 25 to 100 FAQs, but I just picked on a couple that I thought you might be most likely to hear. If my property parcel is in a TID, will my taxes go up? And the answer is no, they will not. The tax rate is the same whether the property is in or out of a TID. And another question that you may get asked is, does being in a TID change how the property assessment is determined if my parcel is in the TID? And the answer also is no. Property in a TID is assessed exactly the same way as other taxable property throughout the city.
Nicola, just
Yes.
a comment, based off of what you've all said in the past here, there's no question in my mind that, this is something we want to have. I know we have a time limit to develop this new TIF, which is going to take advantage of properties that haven't developed yet in other TIDs. That makes great sense, and I don't see any reason to argue against it and to not agree with it. My question is, how quickly can we move this along to a vote? Because
Sure.
I don't know that I need any more information than what you've already given me. We're
Okay.
either going to sit stagnant or we're going to take a risk, and there's no sense in not taking a risk as far as I can tell. We may be on the hook for something, but we'll be on the hook for something someday anyway. If anything, the hook of not growing. So, my thought is, and not to slow this down any, but if we're convinced, how quickly can we get this thing on? And
Sure.
get this going?
And I believe Dan is going to address that when he speaks to you, and that would be the information about the new TIF creation process. And there is statutory requirements for how fast we can move this along, but we're definitely working on it as much as we can and going as fast as we can, within compliance with the rules of TID creation.
You have a window, correct, if I recall from the previous presentation.
A window of advantage, yes. So it's to our advantage to address this and get it accomplished before the beginning of August. Or at the beginning of August.
I mean, you
Yeah.
got me convinced. We have to do something. So
Well, wait till we talk about TID 6 and then you might not be so convinced. So any other questions on this first section? And after this, we go into the reports.
Does the city of Platteville have any spec buildings?
No,
Hey, what?
we
Do
don't
they
have any spec.
buildings. Years
Yeah, I
ago,
don't
we
know.
used to have spec buildings. We expected that they would sell or be used within about 5 years. Do we have anything in the way of spec buildings being built right now?
No.
When I go to Dubuque, I think there's a couple of them on the road, along the road there. They look like they're spec buildings to me. Does Platteville have any?
No, apparently not. So I've been told. No.
Why not?
Maybe Dan can address that when he comes up. I
Okay.
believe it's I think it's a matter of money. And so
Okay,
perhaps
well-
Dan will address that when he comes up in terms of construction costs.
Who's
So-
gonna address that?
Dan, that
Dan?
guy right back there. All right.
Okay.
Let Nicola finish her presentation.
Thank you. No more fireworks. Okay, so TIF 5 is the first one we're going to talk about. And you have a little a map there of TIF 5. You can see Menards and Walmart portrayed as an overhead photograph. And the boundary here is in the green color, and you can see that it is adjacent to the city boundary as well, which is blue. So looking at TIF 5, TIF 5 was created in 2005. The last date to incur project charges in TIF 5 was June 28th of 2020. And the dissolution date, according to the original plans, was June 28th of 2025. And we are on track to close the TIF in 2025. The TIF is a mixed use type of TIF, and you'll know that from the Keystone developments out there, as well as these commercial buildings and other commercial buildings in the TIF. The maximum life of this TIF was 20 years. It does have an extension potential for affordable housing. I'm not going to get into that tonight because we'd be here for a very long time. We can come back to that in a separate discussion when we get closer to that point. But when we get to the next slide, we'll see that there's a lot of revenue generated by this TIF. And so there's a question as to whether we really want to wait an extra year to get that tax base into the city. You can see just a few years of the growth in the TID, the added value in
Nicola, advance your slide.
Thank you.
Twice. Thank you. Twice. Okay.
Okay. So the added value, from 2019 through 2022. And I know you see the drop of 7% versus the two increases of 6% each. And that is due to the state equalization process. So the assessors assess the value of the property in the TIF districts as well as everywhere else, and they submit that to the state. But the state then does their sausage making with the equalization process, and so and the timing of that, it's early in the year when the assessors file the MAR report, and it's later in the year when the equalization process completes. And so sometimes there is some differences that are generated through timing. So that's why there was a decrease in TID 5. Okay, so moving to the next slide. Now what we're looking at is the sources and uses of funds from the beginning of the TIF life through 2021. Then the next column is the actual 2022 results, and then projections for 23 through 25. And I will let you know that these projections for all these TIF districts that I've done are what I would call basic projections. So they don't build in a lot of, anticipated tax increases or value increases. They're kind of flat. So they're pretty conservative. So going back to the actual 2022 activity, you can see there that the total funds for the TIF generated were $912,035. And of that, $900,567 was tax increment. And then down below, you can see the uses of funds. So there was some expenses related to infrastructure site development. There were probably, I'd have to actually go back and see what those were. Promotion, development, organizational costs. So that those are the incubator and the Grant County Economic Development costs are shared between the three TIFs. A little bit of administrative costs, and then the big costs in the TIF are the debt service, $368,064. And so before we get to the highlighted row, those costs are the standard costs for TIF 5. And you can see that in 2023 is the last debt service payment for TIF 5. And then in the projected 24 and 25, there are no debt service payments for the TIF. So let's talk about the green row at the bottom. So TIF 5 shares its revenue with TIF 7. TIF 7 was struggling, and so an amendment was made so that TIF 5 could share its excess increment with TIF 7. So the excess is all of the revenues minus the standard expenses, and what's left can go to TIF 7. So for 2022, that number was $523,438. and you can see how it's projected out through the rest of the years. So at the very bottom, you see the ending fund balance. Because TIF 5 is allocating its extra increment over to TIF 7, then there is neither fund balance or deficit. We always use the exact amount that's available to send it to TIF 7, and so we anticipate that there will be no excess increment at the end or fund balance at the end of the life of the TIF. If there was fund balance left, it would be shared amongst all the taxing jurisdictions. And if there was a deficit at the end, guess who's on the hook? The city would be on the hook. Okay, so that's TIF 5. Let's go to TIF 6. So TIF 6 is our problem child, if you like. You can see the boundary here. The boundary of TIF 6 is in blue, and it looks particularly heavy on the city boundary because that's where TIF 6 is adjacent to the city's boundary. Okay, so TIF 6 was created in 2006. The last date to incur project charges was in 2021. The original date of dissolution was in 2026. This is also a mixed-use TIF. It had a maximum life of 23 years, but we have extended it by 6 years. And when we look at the chart in a minute, we'll see that. So you can see that lately we have had some growth in TIF 6 with 3%, 4%, 7%, and 2% from 2019 to 2022 consecutively. And part of the growth has been the Ubisox Packet commercial office building, IWI Motor Parts expansion, and then there's a little bit just from the state equalization process. Okay, so looking at the projections for TIF 6, so again, you can see the costs, the sources and uses of funds through 2021, and our actuals from for 2022. Sorry, the little tiny numbers here. Hopefully your printed copies are a little easier to see. And then the projections out to 2032. And here you can see the two extensions, the standard extension and the technical college extension. And those extensions had to be approved by the Joint Review Board. Okay, so looking at 2022's activity, you can see that the sources of funds were $590,842 with $587,513 of tax increment, and then a little bit from state aid, which is replacing things to do with property taxes and personal property taxes. And then the uses of funds, again, you've got the incubator and the Grant County Economic Development in the promotion development organizational cost line item. Then you've got administrative costs there, which includes legal fees, and then the debt service payments. So if we look at the green area at the bottom, you can see that at the end of 2022, TIF 6 had a deficit of $573,000. And if you look across and scan your eyes across, you can see that the deficit continues to grow over the next few years, and then it begins to contract in 2029 and going forward to 2032. And you can also see that this projection shows a deficit ending balance at the end of the life of the TIF. So a couple of things have happened in the last few years, since we probably last talked about TIF in this depth. One is that we were anticipating that Cummins would be coming, and they didn't. So the Scannell development, which was the builder of the warehouse, did not come. There was a problem between Cummins and Scannell related to increasing costs that resulted from the pandemic. And so that development did not occur. When that development was built into the projections, everything looked rosy, and we might have even been able to close early. But now we obviously don't have that revenue built in. So one of the things that is reflected in this projection is that the PADIG cost, which is the Platteville Area Industrial Development Corporation, that cost is currently being paid by TIF 6, but if a new TIF is created that overlaps TIF 6 and is, which is going to be that same area, or at least partly, then that cost could be allocated to the new TIF instead of being borne by TIF 6 for the years 2024 through 2032. And so that is reflected in this projection. If it were not, if PADIG continued to be paid out of TIF 6, then the picture would be a little darker at the end of the life of the TIF. The other thing that I want to note is, as I stated, this projection is conservative. You can see that the increment is flat throughout the remaining years of the TIF at 592,559. If tax rates increase during that period of time, which seems likely, then actually the increment will grow. And if the value in TIF 6 also were to grow, then that number would change as well, and it would grow. Now, I can't count on that, but it is to be hoped that property values generally continue to increase. Okay, there was a developer agreement that was established with Southwest Health before the project cost end date, and you've seen the developments already occurred, the infrastructure that has been put in, and we're hoping that there'll be new development, and I think that Dan might touch on that as well. Okay. Okay,
question. Standard and technical college extensions. Would you explain those in more detail, please?
I will. I'll make an attempt. I haven't reread that information lately, so I'm going to be pulling from.
So, where are these located?
Where are what located?
Standard and technical college extensions.
So the extensions are extended years of time.
So here's the standard extension, these 3 years. Here's the technical college extension. This is an extension of the time. And the standard extension is just...
It's just that it's an extension that can be requested of the Joint Review Board, and that they can consider and approve or deny, which they approved. And the technical college extension is one of those law changes that came into play, and it has to do with the state changing some things that meant that I think they funded technical colleges to a greater degree out of the state budget, which meant that the levy that needed to be raised by technical colleges dropped. So their tax rate dropped, which meant tax increment dropped in TIF districts. And so to kind of offset that, the state allowed TIF districts to extend for another 3 years to kind of help recover through time the lost revenue. Dan, if you've got anything to add to that. Okay.
So extension means extending the time.
So more years.
27 to 30 to 33, or from 20 to 23 to 26, however it was.
So another way to put it is, if you see 2026 in this example, the tax increment was 592,559. And let's say nothing changed and that was the tax increment still actually in 2026 and the TID closed. That 592,000 would become part of our tax base, and that increment would be split out between the jurisdictions, because that represents the combined tax rate for all of the different jurisdictions. The tax rates all added together, which is what you get on your tax bill. So each jurisdiction would get its portion of that increment in the years 2027 going forward. But if you extend the TID, that 592,000 stays going to the TIF for each of the years of extension. So you're extending how long the revenue can keep coming to the TIF instead of going to the jurisdictions. And the Joint Review Board, just as a reminder, is made up of those taxing jurisdictions. So it is the taxing jurisdictions themselves that have to decide and approve whether or not they will approve a new TID, and also whether they will extend a TID or amend a TID.
So there's something going special to the technical colleges?
It's not going to the technical college. That's just a name that the state gave that particular type of extension.
That's confusing.
It is. Yeah, but not my fault.
Because right now we're going such a battle with losing technical colleges. We have 13 in the state, and we're losing some of these. And some of them being written off.
I did not know that. But that and this are not related.
It's poor, in my opinion, it's poor terminology, frankly.
I agree. One more thing to confuse you, but
Confusion.
Okay. Any other questions on TIF 6 before we move on? Okay. So now TIF 7, the downtown area, which is outlined in this kind of peachy pink color. We're familiar with TIF 7 because of the library and the Holiday Inn and Wuxton and so forth.
And this is not a mixed use TIF.
This is not. This is, and actually I'll go to the next slide. This is considered a blight district, which is kind of a strong term, but it does reflect if there's properties that are not growing in value. And I actually don't have a definition of blight in front of me, but it does represent areas where there's the property is struggling or there's challenges to the property, difficulties encountered.
Actually, the definition is if a property is not generating the tax that it could generate, then it's considered to be a blighted property.
Okay.
So one could look at the parking lot at McGregor Plaza and say that there's a lot of parking lot there that is not being used. So that part that is not being used is actually blighted property. So it doesn't have anything to do with how it looks. It has to do with whether or not it's generating the tax that it could generate.
Thank you for that clarification. So the TIF 7 was also created in 2006. The last date to incur project charges in TIF 7 is 2028. The dissolution date is 2033. And right now we're on track to be able to close in 2033 without a deficit. The maximum life on this TIF district is 27 years, and it does have extension potential as the other TIFs do. And then you can see the change in values over the last 4 years. And in actual fact, there was a tiny increase from 21 to 22, reflected as 0% on this chart. But it did see growth due to the Wuxton development and in years prior to that due to the Holiday Inn. Okay, moving forward to the results. So in the actual 2022 column, you can see that the tax increment generated annually here was $440,000 with some guaranteed payments made by the developer. So when we create developer agreements, one of our protections is to have a guarantee built into that agreement. And that guarantees that if the development does not generate the increment that is anticipated and agreed upon by the city and the developer, that the developer will pay the difference. And that's the guarantee. And then you can see the total sources of funds was $1,049,466. And you can see also here in the kind of peach highlight is the money coming in from TID 5. So that is the shared increment from TID 5 at $523,438 in 2022. And then you can see the uses of funds, so the promotion development organizational costs and admin costs, the debt service of $746,000 in 2022, and then the lease payments to the developer. So you'll remember that we, the city, don't own the library. The developer owns the library, and we are paying lease payments to them. And according to the agreement, that is until midway 2025, built into the projection as well. And then you can see here that at the end of its life in 2027, that that's just showing you the next 5 years. The end of life would be 2033. And that's the number at the last column, showing a fund balance, a positive fund balance of $637,900, which would be shared out between the various jurisdictions. Okay, so last slide I'm going to talk about, just an overview summary. So TID 5, generation of tax increment, is providing the critical support for TID 7, projected to close in 2025, and a 1-year extension would be allowable for an affordable housing related project. TID 6 I said here that TID 6 is anticipated to recover project costs within the 6 years of extension, if we allocate the paid cost to TIF 9, and that's also assuming that there is growth in the tax rate and growth in the value of those of the TID district itself. And the deficits that you saw generated in the next few years will need to be addressed through a debt restructuring, so that the city does not have to advance from the general fund in those intervening years. And then finally, TID 7 is projected to cover project costs by the end of its life, due to the revenue sharing from TID 5 and due to the developments in there.